Good morning, Year 10. So we are continuing with our love and relationships revision today. So which poems did we have a look at last lesson? Can you remember one of the quotations linked to either of the poems? So we are moving on this lesson. What can you remember about Andrew Waterhouse, and can you remember the title of his poem? So Climbing My Grandfather is Andrew Waterhouse's poem, okay? And not very much to remember in terms of his context, but he was a passionate environmentalist. His love of nature is often reflected in his poems, and he was an experienced mountain climber, which obviously links directly to this poem. So as with our other lessons, have a look at this image. How does it relate to one of the quotations that we had a look at together? Okay then, so I'm hopeful that you got the quotation without a rope or net, otherwise we're in trouble. But the idea is obviously it's an extended metaphor of him deciding to climb his grandfather. So this may imply that he thinks that getting to know his grandfather could be quite a challenge, but he's determined to do it. And alternatively, the fact that he doesn't need a rope or net or any form of safety harness could suggest that the speaker feels safe and secure in his grandfather's presence. We've spoken about with this poem how there's kind of a literal reading and a metaphorical reading. So the literal reading being obviously that he is actually climbing his grandfather as a child, making it from the bottom to the top. He's not worried about falling because his granddad is always going to catch him. But then we also have that metaphorical of kind of climbing the mountain. He sees it in the same way. He's determined to get to know his grandfather, and that's the mountain that he's climbing. So hopefully this has just acted as a quick reminder to you as to the key quotation. So how does this picture relate to the poem's structure then? So obviously I went for the way that the poem begins at the foot of the mountain, at the foot of his grandfather, and continues to build throughout the poem. So it's very kind of cumulative in the way that it develops. It's also written from a first person perspective, so as we know, that adds a much more personal touch to it. And its form is free verse, so it's almost relaxed and conversational, again adding that kind of personal feeling to this poem. And obviously this is all used to emphasize the fact that he feels it's really important that we get to know the elder people within our life, because they have certain experiences, that we don't, and that's an important part of growing up. So moving on to our second poem then, what do you know about Carol Ann Duffy, and can you remember the title of the poem she wrote? So I'm hoping you got Before You Were Mine as the title of the poem, okay, and it's obviously written by Carol Ann Duffy. So the context that is to be remembered, so Before You Were Mine was published in 1993, a modern poem. We know why that's modern, because Miss Roberts was born then, and obviously she's not that old. This poem is autobiographical, so we see this from the references to specific places, so George Square, Portobello. And Duffy references the iconic celebrity of the time period when her mother was young, Marilyn Monroe, who struggled herself to be a mother as she suffered many miscarriages. So all of that kind of feeds into the fact that this is quite a modern interpretation of how somebody felt towards their childhood. So this should be a nice easy one for you. So how does this picture relate to the language used in the poem? So can you write me the quotation down, and can you explode it for me? So I'm hoping you remember the quotation, "Your polka dot dress blows around your legs, Marilyn." So this metaphor paints a mother in a glamorous light by using the iconic 50s star Marilyn Monroe and describing her as a teenager. The keyword Marilyn suggests that Duffy wrote this poem to describe her own feelings towards her mother, and it's clear to see that she had an element of jealousy for who her mother was before the decade of her. Interestingly, Marilyn Monroe herself struggled to have children and suffered many miscarriages, so by comparing her to Monroe, could suggest that deep down these glamorous ladies actually longed for motherhood despite their outward appearances. So we've spoken about this in quite a lot of depth previously, haven't we? So the whole poem gives off this suggestion that Carol Ann Duffy feels like she ruined her mother's life, as though she kind of took that glamorous lifestyle away from her mother, which obviously wasn't the case at all. If we were to look at it from a mother's perspective, that wouldn't have been the same thing. But the idea is that she compares her to Marilyn as being this glamorous woman who really enjoyed her life before she had children. But actually there's that kind of deeper meaning as well, because obviously Marilyn Monroe herself had miscarriages and couldn't have a child, and obviously she committed suicide in the end. And actually, there could be that kind of link that actually, Carol Ann Duffy doesn't really understand what it is to be a mother and how much people do long for that to happen. So how does this picture link to the structure of the poem then, do you think? So I'm hoping you linked it to structure in terms of the idea that the poem begins with the speaker describing her mother's past. So she looks at it like almost through a photographic image. So in I'm 10 years from you, the corner you laugh on, and ends with more images of the mother's past. You sparkle and waltz and laugh before you were mine. So perhaps the structure is used to emphasise Duffy is so fixated on her mother in her younger days that's all she can think of, and the form and structure really emphasises Duffy's feelings about how she ruined her mother's life. In terms of form, again, this one is also written in free verse, so there's no regular rhyme scheme or rhythm, and that can emphasise that this is an anecdote, suggesting Duffy believes these memories are of great importance and emphasises her feelings of jealousy and insecurity about her mother's past. In comparison to, obviously, Climbing My Grandfather, again, it's about obviously learning to get to know people and how that's an important part of life. But also, they're both written in free verse. They're both quite conversational in talking about quite a serious topic, which is more of a modern day way to kind of address issues. I have just given you some ideas previously on the previous slide about how you could compare these two poems, but obviously I'd like you to spend the rest of the lesson creating me a mind map on what sort of comparable elements these poems have. Remember, comparing doesn't always have to be similarities. There's differences involved in comparisons too.